As an excellent blood demon hunter, Chaoxi vows to protect the people of the kingdom to the death, faithfully believes in the church, and is willing to overcome obstacles. All of this is deceiving children. Vampires are something that can never be completely killed. Should she selflessly dedicate all her life to those vulgar and dirty leeches? Or are you still the masters who hold on to their round bellies and are insatiably greedy for their lives? From beginning to end, Chaoxi knew exactly what she wanted. She wanted to shake the master's mouth without any hesitation, and the other party had the right to bow and smile. Yes, these will always come true. She will take it slow first. The first step is to become a blood servant for vampires. Chapter 1. Wedge. You are listening at novelfull.audio. In the dusk, the afterglow of the setting sun scattered its sparse temperature without reservation in the wind, which inadvertently carried the weeds in the field. There stood a wooden execution stand 2 meters high in front of me, with a pure silver long nail piercing through its bone marrow and firmly fixing a silver-haired blood race. It stared at its blood-red eyes with fierce eyes, its skin burned by something, emitting a burnt and foul smell. Is this a vampire? A demon that can suck up every drop of human blood and kill invisibly with every move and gesture, a butcher walking at night. As rumored, it will self-ignite when exposed to sunlight until it burns to ashes. The setting sun is just about to disappear, and when it comes to night, there is a chance to catch a breath. It will break free from the shackles of the pure silver long nail at any cost, and then crazily repay the culprit that caused everything. Chaoxi trembled with fear all over her body. She wanted to turn her head and run, but someone grabbed her arm and pulled her closer. No, please don't let me stay here. The response to her was a loud slap, which caused a brief ringing in the ears. Bitch slave, you better not sneak away at night without knowing what's going on. The scolding man's voice was strong and could not refuse. Listen up, you must stay here all the time to guard him. If any nail comes loose, use the hammer in your hand to hit it hard until tomorrow when the sun rises. Do you understand? Chaoxi shook her head desperately, trying to arouse a little sympathy from the man. She wanted to stay with the vampire for a night, how could she possibly do it? If it broke free, how could she possibly stop it? Once something unexpected happens, running away is unnecessary. She doesn't want to die, she still wants to live. The man sternly warned, if he disappears from here tomorrow, you'll just wait and be nailed here too. After speaking, he hurriedly got onto the carriage that had arrived, without looking back. He threw Chaoxi down and let a frail 16-year-old girl face danger alone. She even struggled to swing a hammer. If she was really worried that the vampire would break free, she should let 2 strong young men guard her, at least with the strength to fight back. Everyone is afraid of death, not just Chaoxi. She is a lowly servant, and no one cares about her life or death. She was unlucky enough to be picked over. Since she knew how to read, she was sold into slavery, often subjected to physical abuse and physical abuse. In order to eat a meal and not become rotten meat under the whip, she endured everything, worked hard, and flattered. Not many servants can live to adulthood with their entire bodies and tails, which seems like an unbreakable curse. Chaoxi tried her best to avoid the manipulation of those masters. A group of sluts as night falls, the chill rustles through, and the silver-haired blood race on the brink of death in the darkness moans in pain intermittently in their throats. The vampire who was nailed to the cross was caught this evening. They cut it into countless pieces, put it in a bag, sank it into the bottom of the river, poured diesel on it, and set it on fire. No way could they kill it. It is the child of the Grim Reaper, and only the noon sunshine can make them disappear completely. Sensing the presence of the other person, the silver-haired vampire's voice was hoarse, and after suffering from all the torment, only a trace of intelligence remained. Help. Perhaps it was because his throat was nailed that he couldn't say a complete sentence, but in the few words he could still confirm that he was seeking help from Chaoxi. Will vampires also be afraid? They will also be timid and afraid of death like humans. Even powerful creatures like this cannot escape the fate of being forced to death. It is so similar to Chaoxi that, after tonight, only one of them can survive. In just an instant, all the fears of Chaoxi were gone, and a crazy thought surged uncontrollably. Looking up at the silver-haired vampire on the cross, a pair of blood-red pupils also stared at the polluted girl. That scorching heat seems to be penetrating through the other party. Chaoxi's chest was scorching hot, and the hammer she held in her palms suddenly threw into the field. She turned around and plunged into the distance, running wildly. Did she run away? No, Chaoxi had no intention of doing so. The consequences of escaping were either being beaten to death by the master and thrown to feed the dog, or starving to death in the wilderness. So she quickly ran back, with only an axe stuck in the mud in her hand. Under the gaze of her blood-red eyes, without saying a word, she swung an axe towards the standing base of the cross. The girl's strength was weak, leaving only shallow chisel marks. Then came another axe strike, followed by another one, a series of vibrations transmitted through the wooden stakes to the silver-haired vampire above, their blood pupils red even more eerie. Quickly, the wooden stake broke off from the base, and the cross fell with the blood tribe in the wild grass. It is embedded with pure silver spikes all over its body, unable to move, but for vampires, the most deadly ones are the forehead and heart. Pull them out, they. Chaoxi pounced on him, squeezing her fingertips into her bloodshot chest, groping for a hard object, and desperately pulling it out with all her strength. The long nail penetrated deep into the bone marrow, and thick blood gushed out. As it was gradually pulled out, the minced meat wriggled as if it were alive. When the long nail was completely pulled out, blood splattered, and at the same time, both fingernails were hard to break. The excruciating pain made Chaoxi scream out loud. At this moment, she completely disregarded it, like a madman gripping the long nail on the forehead of the silver-haired vampire. When she tried again, it slipped due to the sticky blood, and she couldn't exert any force. She suddenly took a deep breath and bent down to bite it with her teeth. With a whimper, the long nail pulled out with plasma. In an instant, the piercing cold wind permeated the night, and the full moon turned into a sky full of blood. Chaoxi watched as the silver-haired vampire's charred skin wriggled beneath her, and the blood hole disappeared in the blink of an eye. It was restoring its original appearance at a terrifying speed. Blood pupils contracted greedily and stared fixedly at Chaoxi. She was not afraid, nor did she run away. Instead, she pinched the silver-haired vampire's cheek with both hands and gritted her teeth, saying inwardly, "Go kill them. Kill those scumbags." His voice was hoarse and not like that of a living person. Chaoxi had never experienced such pleasure before, as if decades of torture had finally been vented at this moment. With a brief breath, the flesh and blood of the silver-haired vampire's limbs burst open, and the flesh grew into an immature, foul-smelling monster. It opened its bloodthirsty mouth and swallowed Chaoxi's entire body. Then the crimson pupils looked towards the nearby lights, and the body turned into blood and plunged into the river, flowing away. Chapter 2. Plan Start. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Every time she recalled the thrilling scene of that night, Chaoxi couldn't help but tremble. Except for herself, those who had been stained with the blood of vampires had all died, and the death was particularly terrifying, with withered limbs falling everywhere. She couldn't figure out why it didn't kill herself. As an upper echelon of the food chain, the desire for blood was an instinctive response, especially when she was in a weak state. There was no reason to suppress her nature. Is it because I helped it? It's like a medium-cooked and greasy steak in front of me, but it just licked it hungry and then walked away with determination. The scene of Chaoxi's brain filling was somewhat amusing. Looking at the woman in the mirror, her long black curly hair wrapped around a fair and delicate facial feature, and her black eyes were clear. She pulled open the hair between her neck, revealing the bite marks on it. Fingertips caressing the bulging growth on her neck must have put in a lot of effort, otherwise it wouldn't have left such a big scar. Fortunately, she didn't bite her arm and ate her leg, turning her into a cripple. It's really unlucky to think about it like this. I met a vampire with clear grievances and strong willpower. Footsteps could be heard from afar outside the door, and then the bathroom door was pushed open. The person clicked twice and glanced at the well-proportioned woman in front of the washroom mirror. She's still pretty. You should have some confidence in yourself. Chaoxi brushed her hair back to the front, covering the scar on her neck, and then calmly welcomed the visitor, pushing him out with her hand. Don't you know that breaking into women's houses at will is a very vulgar behavior? The person who came was not annoyed, and was pushed out of the door, staring at the black-haired girl to tidy up her appearance, scanning her recklessly. It was very graceful, but too flamboyant, not restrained. It was not like a lonely and unfortunate person, but rather like an aunt invited over. This is not easy to fool, those vampire leeches like delicate and charming little white flowers. It's better to be simple, and take a bite to struggle back and forth with tears streaming down their faces. This little girl won't wait until she sees someone not putting on a dress, she'll take out a knife from under her skirt and cut them off. Hiss, it's hard to say, after all, it's the person who came from that place. So the man declared again, do you remember what I said before? You are now an inexperienced noblewoman, you must be inexperienced and pitiful, so that you can be targeted by the Blood Clan and take their territory. You don't need to teach. Without looking back, Chaoxi picked up the warm white shawl hanging from the back of the chair and draped it over her shoulders, feeling too straight. The collar was pulled down a bit, revealing her slender collarbone faintly. No one knows how to serve the master better than me. After being washed by vampires in the small town where she lived as a child, she died and ran away, completely abandoned. Chaoxi fainted by the river and was taken back by members of the Blood Hunting Cross Church who happened to pass by. As its name suggests, this is the Church of Croy, a human organization dedicated to killing blood races. They concentrate on cultivating talented blood demon hunters to ensure that the kingdom's territory is not attacked by vampires. The church is particularly rigorous in selecting members, and the 3 generations of ancestors must have a clean background and no criminal behavior. They will start selecting from children under the age of 10, with those with good facial features and beautiful appearance being given priority. In addition, they need to be intelligent and have strong limbs. Once selected, they will be taken away from home and raised by the church. Obviously, except for her delicate appearance, the rest of Chaoxi did not meet her expectations. However, they still made an exception and allowed her to live because it was rare to see a living person with 2 blood holes on her neck. After waking up, Chaoxi still bounced around like a carefree person. They believed that Chaoxi must have some outstanding qualities. The result was that they made the right bet. This guy was like an indefatigable machine. After learning that she would be abandoned if she couldn't keep up, she would recite knowledge and exercise her physical fitness day and night, either eating or studying. In just a few months, she would make up for all the knowledge and physical fitness that she had been lacking in slavery for over a decade, and continuously improve at an astonishing speed. In 6 years, she went from an ignorant girl with poor development to a blood demon hunter with excellent appearance and outstanding performance, and has become one of the few outstanding figures in the church. From her body, there was no trace of her original appearance. After changing her appearance, she completely transformed into a different person, but what remained unchanged were her stubborn nature and her unwavering beliefs. The reason why she was chosen for this mission is because her godfather Xianyan knew very well what she had always longed for. The church has received the news that the eyeliner planted in the senior level of the Blood Clan has been killed in order to get internal information in the future. It needs to rearrange people to sneak in. Chaoxi, you are our favorite person, and I hope you will not let us down. Upon hearing the news for the first time, Chaoxi couldn't help but frown, unwilling to take on such a dangerous and costly task. Let me be the blood servant of those leeches. Oh, this kind of good thing can only think of me. Xianyan responded, it's not just you. The church will also arrange for others to be in the areas where blood races often appear. At that time, I will give you the identity of a noble daughter in the royal city, and lure the hunting blood races to take you to the territory of the blood races. I chose you because I promised you that after the mission is over, this identity will be yours. You can leave the church and return to your own home, continuing to live a noble life. Chaoxi's eyelashes trembled slightly. This old man had made sure that she couldn't refuse such a condition. TSK, he really figured it out. She wouldn't be foolish enough to consider the church as a family, let alone believe that the identity Zhou Yuanyang gave her could be considered as her own family. What Chaoxi values is the word aristocrat. In this era, how could there be such a concept of home? The only thing that can establish oneself is identity and status. The experience of serving the master for more than a decade tells her that only by becoming the master can one live the best life. Chaoxi agreed and lived in the luxurious villa of the royal city as she wished. In order to achieve the goal of pretending to be a real character, she enjoyed the life of a noblewoman in advance, the etiquette and speech of the nobles, and the gathering activities, accompanied by dozens of servants. For all of this, she enjoys it freely. After all, everything now is making up for the unknown fate that is about to come. Predicting the feeding patterns and frequent areas of the bleeding tribe, Chaoxi has been hovering on the edge of danger several times, in order to make the leeches in the darkness notice her. Look, it's that pampered human noble lady. When going out, there must be guards who support and protect her carefully, holding a noble and inviolable demeanor. She should be taken captive and become the forbidden territory of the Blood Earl. They cannot openly take action, which will inevitably cause considerable panic. If it attracts the attention of those bloodthirsty hunters, it will not be worth the loss. The church loyal to the royal family will definitely take action and strangle them in the scorching sun. So, we must wait for an opportunity. The capricious noblewoman herself didn't even know that she would sneak out without any guards, which was just right. And these leeches in the sewer were unaware that their actions were within Chaoxi's plan. On a noisy street outside the city of Wang, Chaoxi, who was only accompanied by 2 maids, looked around with a curious gaze, as if every little thing in common life made her find it interesting. The maid who followed her couldn't be happy at all. She carefully pushed away the rude commoner who was coming towards her and advised, "Miss, let the servant take you back. This is really chaotic." The other person also followed closely and said, "Yes, Miss sneaks out like this. If the master finds out, she will be scolded." They were completely unaware of Xiaoxi's purpose, and it was precisely because they did not know that their performance was genuine enough. Amidst the noise, Chaoxi keenly smelled a hint of blood, and the bright sunlight seemed to dim slightly, with a hint of laughter silently flowing through her eyes. She couldn't bear it anymore and couldn't wait to take action. How could Chaoxi not fulfill their wishes? She shook off the maid's hand in dissatisfaction and said, "If you don't want to follow, go back. It's rare to come out, I don't want any noise in my ear." The 2 maids panicked and ran to catch up, wanting to stop them but not daring to reach out. "Miss, we are really worried about Mississippi. The streets are all lowly people, and in case anyone who doesn't have eyes offends you." Chaoxi interrupted in a deep voice, "What's the danger? Are you offending me by touching my arm or stepping on my foot? You're just worried that my father will punish you if he finds out, but you'll come out for a while and go back soon." "No, no, no, miss. We're just..." "Miss. Where are you going?" They were frantically trying to explain, but the young lady suddenly quickened her pace and walked towards the crowd. The crowd was gathering, and as soon as she lifted her foot to follow, she was blocked by the oncoming crowd. With a slight glance, the young lady disappeared without a trace. The 2 of them turned pale in fear and quickly pushed aside the crowd, calling out loudly. However, the young lady who had always lacked physical strength couldn't run so fast, and they couldn't keep up. Chaoxi shuttled through the crowd, without any notice from the common people around her. The shadow under her feet was even darker than that of ordinary people, like an bottomless black hole. If she stopped to rest for a moment, she would be dragged into the pitch-black abyss. Chaoxi sneered, keeping up so closely that she was afraid of letting herself go. This was the best way to avoid worrying that the other person wouldn't fall into the trap. The main street was crowded with people with mixed eyes, and they dared not shake their hands openly. Looking around, they found a remote alley with towering buildings on both sides blocking all the sunlight. Her eyes flickered slightly and she ran in. As soon as one foot stepped into the shadow, the scenery in front of me changed rapidly, as if it had arrived at a pitch-black night. Suddenly, my ears fell silent, and only my own rapid breathing echoed. The beautiful lady leaned against the wall and realized for a while that something was wrong. She turned back to look in the direction she had been coming from, but was hugged by a thin and pale arm from behind. She screamed in fear, and her soft lips were covered by the other hand. She was like a frightened rabbit, struggling desperately until it was completely engulfed by darkness. Chapter 3. Blood Clan. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chaoxi's acting skills remained stable, and as expected, she was captured by the Blood Clan. In the darkness, her consciousness was exceptionally clear, and she could feel herself moving rapidly. There were clusters of black shadows flying over her head, and she could vaguely hear the chaotic sounds of conversation. Those are shadows, not just humans, but also livestock, plants, buildings. She wants to know roughly what ability it is to catch her own vampire. The Blood Clan makes a living by sucking fresh blood. They possess eternal life and an ageless appearance, agile and incredibly powerful, and their appearance is extremely similar to that of humans. It's not difficult to distinguish them. They can only live in the dark, so their skin is sickly fair, their body temperature is only half that of humans, they have a pair of bright red pupils, and 2 exceptionally sharp teeth. In addition to these, they also have some special abilities that humans can distinguish into 4 different types. A shadow that can wander in the darkness, coming and going without a trace. Apostle of the god of fate, a cursor who speaks freely. A traitor who can walk in the sunlight without any bloodline characteristics. A flesh grinder is a person who can control the body to change any form at will. At present, she should have been abducted by shadows. Chaoxi breathed a sigh of relief to herself. Although she had a way to deal with any type of blood race, her instinct was still not to confront flesh and blood. The shadows are eerie and unpredictable, mastering the laws of space. Once they enter the darkness, they melt like water in the sea, difficult to capture and can only be expelled. To deal with a cursor, one only needs to seal its mouth. If one cannot speak, there is basically no harm. However, most cursors are cunning and can use their abilities to arrange their own destiny. They can always survive in desperate situations and even turn the tide. To seal their mouth, one must play even more sinister. Although those traitors have the weakest abilities, being discovered is equivalent to being caught. The difficulty lies in their resemblance to humans and their lack of any way to judge their non-human nature. If there is suspicion of traitors infiltrating, the safest way is to rather kill them by mistake and never let them go. But flesh and blood are a complete madman, as if they were born to kill, and once they confront them, it is a life-threatening battle. Those crazily wriggling pieces of meat, no matter how many pieces they are cut into, can reproduce infinitely. Not only can they not be cut to death, but they can also be turned into any sharp weapon, cutting iron like mud, with extraordinary vitality. Many blood demon hunters died in their hands. Fortunately, it has its drawbacks. Their intelligence seems to have not fully evolved, and they can only be considered as children with incomplete intelligence. They do not know how to escape, and only need to drag until the sun rises, and they will turn into ashes. With this in mind, Chaoxi would recall the vampire she had saved that night. If the church knew that she had once let go of a flesh and blood victim, she would probably be so angry that she would have to come back and kick her. After capturing the shadow of Chaoxi for a period of time, they finally arrived at their destination. In a whirlwind, a light finally appeared in their field of vision. What appeared in front of me was a prison cell, with a pungent stench emanating from it, like the smell of carrion emanating from certain animal carcasses that had been stored for a long time, making my nose and eyes sour and unbearable. There were also some kidnapped girls here, and the Blood Clan and Chaoxi suddenly appeared, causing them to scream and shrink to the corner, trembling and sobbing. They were all tied with heavy shackles around their necks, with iron ropes embedded in the stone walls. Some were still intact, some had missing legs, some had missing ears, and some even had their abdominal cavities hollowed out and bleeding. Their limbs were scattered on the ground. The source of the foul odor is evident at a glance. Chaoxi was in a daze before her eyes, and the Blood Clan suddenly let go of their grip on her. Her feet softened and she stumbled back to the wall, frightened by the chaos in the other place and losing her color. The Blood Clan loves to see this fragile expression the most, their tongue cannot help but lick their dry lips, and their footsteps approach closely. No, don't come over. Behind her was the wall, and Chaoxi had no choice but to retreat. It was unclear if it was due to her struggle that the shawl on her shoulders slipped off, revealing her radiant shoulders and the large, explosive skin on her chest. The crimson eyes of the Blood Clan deepened, and they pounced directly. Their thin palms grabbed her slender neck, lowered their heads, and the tip of their nose took a deep breath on her shoulder, squinting their eyes as if enjoying it. Chaoxi screamed in fear and quickly shouted, "You know who my father is." Upon hearing this, the Blood Clan let out a playful laugh, and his throat became even more thirsty as he swallowed. He said softly, "You reminded me that the esteemed lady should be left for the Count to enjoy. Hee, you can still rest for a while." He released the hand that was gripping her neck, locked the heavy iron shackles around her neck, and watched as she bit her lips in humiliation. However, due to fear and reluctance to resist, he couldn't help but extend his long tongue and greedily licked the cold sweat on her cheek, disappearing in the blink of an eye. Chaoxi felt a chill until it was confirmed that she had walked away. Her feigned expression gradually faded from her face, wiping away saliva and pulling back the shawl that had fallen from her words. Lowering her head, the girls who were caught realized they were far away from her, but there was plenty of space left by her side. She then found a cleaner spot to sit down and rest. Just a lowly vampire wanted to mark her, almost causing trouble. To infiltrate the upper echelons, one must at least find the Count to take action. The Blood Clan also has titles, generally distinguished according to the purity of their bloodline. The ancestor of the Blood Clan, Lilith, was the first vampire, whose flesh and blood cultivated 13 princes. Below the princes was the Duke, followed by the Marquis, Count, Viscount, Baron, and the Blood Clan below was equivalent to the lowly people in humanity. The closer the bloodline is to the ancestor, the stronger its ability, and the higher its status in the Blood Clan. Conversely, the more mixed the bloodlines, the weaker its ability, and the lower its status in the Blood Clan. Time flies, and now Lilith is in a deep sleep. 13 princes fight against each other, leaving only 4 princes and their descendants, which are the 4 clans today. Shadow, Curse, Flesh, and Traitor. There is an agreement between clans to not disturb or interfere with each other. If a younger generation of a Blood Clan breaches a contract in another territory, they can be dealt with according to local laws and regulations. The Blood Clan captured by Chaoxi is the Shadow, and it is impossible for him to bring it to the territory of other clans, so it can be determined that he is currently in the Shadow's territory. Chaoxi, who had sorted out her situation, shifted her thoughts to other girls. Looking around, there were more than 10 girls who had the same experience imprisoned here. They were only 15 or 16 years old, and most of them were not wearing any clothes. Some of them reluctantly left torn rags to cover important parts, with thin cheeks and no visible blood. Chaoxi is actually the oldest among them. Their necks, chests, arms, and thighs are covered in bite marks, and some girls have been abused to the point of being physically disabled and dying, gazing blankly into the distance, perhaps praying for a painless breathing. What is the difference between them and their former selves, but they are used for entertainment and entertainment? Chaoxi took off her shawl and walked over to the nearest girl, watching her body shrink in fear or cold, draped over her. Chaoxi crouched down and asked, "How long have you been brought here?" The girl looked up at her without saying a word, just shaking her head in confusion. Chaoxi could only give up the idea of asking for information from the girls. The dim cell had no concept of time, only to know that after a long time, Chaoxi finally sensed the approaching aura of a blood tribe. Soon, the feeling was fulfilled, and a blood tribe suddenly appeared from the shadow, with a wooden tray in hand, with several dishes of dry bread and water on top. He placed the food on the ground, picked up a plate of bread and juice coated with bright red sauce, looked around, and his gaze was fixed on Chaoxi, his thin mouth grinning eerily. If her gaze could do something, she believed that this thing could not wait to devour her alive. "This is yours, give it a try." He handed the plate in his hand to Chaoxi, who did not take it. He stood still, his crimson eyes fixed on her. The two stood in a stalemate for a long time, with a strong tendency not to leave unless he took it. Chaoxi was stared at with fear, and could only reach out to take it. However, he didn't leave yet, but insisted on watching her eat it. She took a deep breath, picked up a piece of bread and bit it into her mouth. The strong bloody smell filled her nose, and the unknown viscous jam spread on her tongue, making the taste surprisingly sweet. The blood-raced man suddenly let out a mocking laugh, and soon his body dissolved into the darkness, disappearing without a trace. After confirming his departure, Chaoxi spewed out what was in her mouth without saying a word, feeling nauseous in her stomach. It seemed that it was not something that people should eat. The other girls rushed forward, grabbing the remaining bread and water from the ground, eagerly feeding them into their mouths. They didn't know if they had chewed them, so they hastily swallowed them down. The little bread quickly swept away, leaving no crumbs. Chaoxi was stunned by their movements, and after a moment, she silently placed the item in her hand on the ground. One by one, they stared straight at the bread coated with sauce, but no one came forward to take it. Perhaps they were afraid, so Chaoxi pushed it out again. This time, someone couldn't resist and rushed forward to grab it, stuffing it into her mouth. Chaoxi wanted to ask her to slow down, but no one was arguing. The words were swallowed back to her mouth, and she sighed and sat back against the wall. Forget it, she wasn't much better either. There should still be many such cells in the Blood Clan territory. How many girls are being locked up, and how many girls are quietly dying? Chaoxi was thinking about what she could do. Perhaps she could find a way to contact the church to rescue them. It all depends on the strength of the Blood Earls in this territory. If 3 or more blood demon hunters were to be sent to deal with it, the church probably wouldn't take action. They never do anything difficult or pleasing. This matter is beyond her scope of task and shouldn't be her concern. The mission has just begun. Time was indistinguishable, slowly flowing away, and the dim cell welcomed its unwelcome guests. 2 blood race men appeared silently from the darkness and suddenly grabbed the ankle of a young girl next to Chaoxi, pulling towards the darkness. The girl screamed in terror, the chains on her neck wriggling, and the girls in the entire cell trembled violently, trembling and hesitant to speak. Another man walked forward and untied the shackles on the girl's neck. Without restraint, the girl was pulled straight by the hand at her ankle. As she passed by Chaoxi, she instinctively grabbed her arm and shouted desperately, "Help me! Ah! Help me!" Chaoxi grabbed her back. 6 years of hard training had made her arm strength amazing, instantly stopping her downward trend. With the other hand gripping the chain on the wall, she used force to pull her back. 2 pairs of crimson pupils locked in an instant, and Chaoxi's pupils shrank slightly, reflecting that his actions might expose his identity. But the girl seemed to have grabbed the last straw, tightly grasping Chaoxi with both hands, screaming and crying for mercy. "Don't let go. Please. I don't want to die. Don't let go." Chapter 4. Pray. You are listening at novelfull.audio. She is clear about her purpose. If her identity is exposed now, it means the mission has failed. Failure not only means that her noble identity will be lost, but even her life will be buried here. She has no ability to save others. In the desperate gaze of the young girl, Chaoxi pretended to be defeated and was dragged to the ground, then released her hand. In the scream, the girl's figure disappeared into the shadow. The noblewoman couldn't bear to close her eyes, but suddenly a cold chill came from her back. A thin hand touched her slender waistline, moving upwards, and her rough hand maliciously caressed her delicate skin. At this moment, a blood clan was lying on her back, as if unable to resist such temptation. His cold tongue licked the depression of her shoulder blade and said softly, "Beautiful lady, you are so cute." Watching her trembling with fear beneath her, she choked up in her throat and cursed, "Animal." All of these were teasing his bloodthirsty nature, but he had to give it a little try and his voice became hoarse. "Don't worry, it's your turn soon. When the Count gets tired of playing, you'll be mine." After the cold aura on her back disappeared, Chaoxi felt a strong chill and calmly got up from the ground, spitting fiercely at something. It is unknown where the girl was taken, and the only thing that Chaoxi knew was that she never appeared again. One after another, some girls were taken away, some came back, some didn't, and those who luckily returned always had incomplete bodies. The most serious thing was that they had their stomachs cut open, their organs eaten clean, and they still had a breath left. Chaoxi couldn't imagine what they relied on to hold on. In the long wait, Chaoxi was finally taken away from this cage, and only a few of the remaining dozen or so girls survived at this time. They didn't know Chaoxi's purpose, but when they saw this extraordinary aristocratic girl being dragged and swallowed into the darkness, the aristocratic lady was no exception, let alone the lowly ones. Their vague expectations were also shattered. Another time, she was lurking in the dazzling shadows. This time, without waiting too long, Chaoxi was taken to a strange place. The crystal chandelier flickered on and off, and as one gazed at the 10-meter-long table, there were a dazzling array of plates and food, with a sweet aroma enveloping the air. At the table sat 11 young men dressed neatly, elegantly cutting through the flesh and blood on the plates, savoring the original taste of the food. The arrival of Chaoxi made their movements slightly slow, slowly shifting their gaze to her. The blood clan has eternal life, and their appearance always stays at the most spirited moment, just like the 11 sitting in front of them, with pale skin, handsome eyebrows, some with long silver hair draped over them, and some with simple black hair. Just sitting like this makes the rest of them dare not look up. But no matter how glamorous the appearance may be, it cannot conceal the decaying soul beneath the skin and flesh. The blood clan brought by Chaoxi bowed sincerely and said, "This is a noble girl from the human royal family. Ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy it." After speaking, he disappeared into the shadow. Chaoxi looked up at the blood clan, and a thin layer of cold sweat couldn't help but burst out from her back. It was the first time she had faced a blood clan marquis and 3 earls head on, and she was left alone and helpless behind, almost desperate. At this moment, the flame of the crystal chandelier was extinguished. In the dark night, 11 pairs of crimson pupils emitted a bloodthirsty red light, staring straight at the slender woman below the hall like venomous snakes. The delicate young lady suddenly turned pale, constantly retreating in fear, rushing out of the hall in a panic and running frantically. Deep laughter echoed in the dimness, as if lingering in Chaoxi's ears. The vast palace was empty, with no one to stop it. It was like watching a slaughtered lamb struggling to death in a cage. Strangely, even though the palace gate is close in front of us, it always leads to a dead end and gets further and further away. Of course, Chaoxi knew what the reason was. These were the abilities of the shadow. If she had really let the blind cat run into a dead mouse and slip out, she would have really seen a ghost. The shadow at the end of the corridor in front of him grew longer, and the silver-haired blood race slowly emerged from inside. He seemed to know that Chaoxi would come here, and as she ran in from the corner, he quickly hugged her waist, pinched her chin with one hand, forcing her to look up. Chaoxi ran away regardless of her demeanor, causing her dark, cascading long curly hair to scatter haphazardly on her face. A pair of violently contracting pupils were shining through her hair, and tears flowed down her face as she looked up. She saw the blood race's throat rolling in front of her, opened her mouth, and her sharp fangs exposed, bending over and approaching her neck. Chaoxi pushed him away with a single push, just a viscount, actually trying to mark her. Don't be at a loss. Unexpectedly, with such great strength, the silver-haired blood clan was slightly surprised and couldn't help but smile as they looked at her fleeing figure. A figure appeared again in the shadow ahead, and Chaoxi stopped immediately. When she saw clearly that the viscount was still present, she immediately turned the direction. As a result, another blood clan appeared behind him, still the viscount. Chaoxi was in a dilemma when she suddenly noticed an additional row of stairs descending on her right side. In a panic, she ran straight down the stairs. Two blood clans stood at the stairwell, looking at her with an ambiguous smile. Where did this staircase lead to? Chaoxi had some expectations, and as expected, she suddenly stepped on it empty. The staircase disappeared inexplicably, becoming an endless abyss, and her body fell down like a weightless weight. The image in front of me is rapidly distorted, like an oil painting encountering water, spreading and smudging, and the main hall becoming chaotic and unformed. Damn it, a group of perverts. Her falling body was caught by a pair of sturdy arms, and a strong smell of blood rushed towards her. The strong pressure forced her body to stiffen. That's right, it was a blood earl who caught her. This is the first time I've been up close, especially when I don't have anything to defend myself against. You should know that dealing with an ordinary blood earl requires the joint killing of 3 fully armed blood demon hunters, and there is not even 100% certainty. Today, for the first time, she fell into the blood clan's lair, facing 3 counts and a marquee. If she could live back, it would be enough for her to show off for a lifetime. The frightened Miss Human fell into his arms, her crimson eyes filled with sparkling tears. Her snow-white and slender fingers struggled to break the arms that had imprisoned her, but unfortunately, the harder they tried, the tighter they hugged. Such a beautiful scene deepened the crimson in the Count's eyes before her, and he bent down to bite her panting lips. The choking smell penetrated into her mouth, causing her to cough uncontrollably. Chaoxi resisted the urge to twist his head off and did not engage in any inappropriate behavior. The Count licked off the bloodstains at the corner of her mouth and tasted a sweet taste. His crimson pupils showed a difference and he chuckled softly in her ear, "Has anyone ever said that your taste is too unique?" Chaoxi felt extremely ashamed, gritted her teeth and turned her head. Her strands of ink hair were soaked in sweat and stuck to her neck, revealing the faintly pulsating meridians perfectly. This is simply a blatant temptation. The Count breathed lightly, his throat rolling, and he had no intention of enduring it. He brushed aside the hair around his neck, opened his mouth, and was about to bite hard. Suddenly, he saw the healed bite marks on her neck, and a hint of oppression came out. The crimson pupils suddenly contracted, and as she hugged the woman's arm, she lost her strength. Suddenly, Chaoxi fell down again, something she had never imagined. She showed a hint of real panic on her face, reaching out to grab something to stop the downward trend. Fortunately, it didn't fall for too long, and her back was caught by a soft object, saving a lot of impact. Chaoxi looked at the crystal chandelier above her head in shock, and the distorted image suddenly returned to normal. After a while of not calming down, what was this? She was despised. Without giving her a chance to think carefully, a stranger's voice came to her ear again. "Why, didn't Albert take a liking to you?" The oppressive feeling of the person swept through once again, and this time it was completely different. It was irresistible, completely suppressed in the bloodline, exceeding the danger level of the Count. His identity was only that one. Chaoxi's mouth twitched. It's not easy to handle now. The sound of footsteps approached, and she hurriedly supported herself, wanting to get up. As soon as she sat up, the shadow in front of her pressed down, and her slender hand gently pushed her forehead before being pushed down on the soft ground. How could such a soft fabric and powerful rebound have such a floor? The only explanation is on the bed of a certain bedroom. Her body was pressed up by a heavy object, and Chaoxi immediately met a pair of crimson pupils. The person's soft black hair slipped from her neck and fell into her ear, entwined with her own black hair. Chaoxi's breath followed closely, this damn sense of crisis. Let me see what's going on. He somehow captured Chaoxi's hands and imprisoned them above her head, while the other hand pushed her cheek aside, revealing the healed bite marks on her neck, and the bulging growths arrogantly declared sovereignty. The Marquis's expression remained unchanged, and upon closer inspection, he quickly realized, I see. He straightened Chaoxi's face again, twisted the broken hair blocking her facial features with his fingertips, carefully traced her contours, and soon smiled and squinted his eyes. I have a good eye, but unfortunately I was too careless. How could I casually leave you outside? Look, the frightened little rabbit can't find its home anymore. Chaoxi didn't know what he was talking nonsense about, all she knew was that there was a lot of trouble now. The reason why her goal is to become an earl is because within a controllable range, the other party's abilities and details are understood, so that there will not be too many mistakes. Even when working as an undercover agent, which is a life-or-death frontline task, there must be a great deal of confidence. But the Marquis is different. The Church has too little information about the Marquis, and Chaoxi has never encountered him in the mission. Their existence is too mysterious. She couldn't guarantee that she wouldn't be caught sneaking around under the watchful eye of a Marquis, in case her identity was exposed. Chaoxi couldn't imagine how tragic her death would be. God bless, I hope not to be marked by him. Since you're here, don't leave. Chaoxi was almost choked to death by her own crow's mouth. The Marquis leaned down and kissed the bite mark on her neck, his cold and soft tongue smoothly teasing her skin, causing Chaoxi to shiver uncontrollably. Clear sensations penetrated every conscious nerve in her. Say hello to it for me. Chaoxi was still puzzled by the meaning of the sudden words, and a piercing pain came from her neck, as if a sharp object had bitten through her skin. She immediately became tense. The teeth gradually increased in gravity, and the piercing pain deepened. The bedding was tanned into a ball in her hand, and Chaoxi still couldn't resist. A sobbing sound came from her nose. The Marquis seemed to feel that he was still not deep enough, and he lifted Chaoxi's chest with one hand, burying his head deeper, and even harshly amplifying the sucking sound in her ear. The unbearable pain passed in the blink of an eye, and Chaoxi's body quickly relaxed and collapsed weakly on the bed. She only felt that the area around her that had been bitten had become numb, and her consciousness had also become blurred. The brain gradually empties and the mind slows down. These are because the saliva of the blood clan has a nerve-numbing effect, in order to prevent prey from running away again. Chaoxi didn't expect that the effect would be even more fierce than expected. Chapter 5. Seizing Food. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The so-called mark is when the blood clan takes a liking to a certain prey to prevent it from being coveted by other similar species, and deliberately leaves their own scent. Not all bitten prey will leave a scent, it depends on whether the blood clan intends to directly absorb it or leave it to taste slowly. The eyes of the blood clan can be considered picky. Those who are too old to look up to, and those who are too ugly are not desirable. Those who achieve the above 2 points can survive under the ordinary blood clan, while those with higher status in the blood clan will only look up to the noble ladies in the human race who are prestigious and pampered. The more noble their status is, the more they can demonstrate their status in the same clan. That's why the church arranged for her to have a fake identity. Chaoxi began to feel a bit uneasy about whether this Marquis would make a final move. After all, what was summarized above was only experience. Whether he could survive or not could only depend on his mood. Chaoxi's worries did not occur. Although the Marquis was suspected of intentionally scaring her, fortunately in the end, he released his mouth and blood flowed down the wound. He used his cold fingertips to grope for the newly added wound, not knowing if it was intentional. He happened to bite the original wound, with overlapping new and old bite marks, making the scar even more ferocious. The Marquis, however, seemed still dissatisfied and chuckled softly, "Can't the smell cover it up?" The furrowed brow quickly relaxed, and his eyes narrowed under the firm brow. He dipped his fingertips in blood and applied it to her lifeless lips, which were bright red and particularly charming. "Your blood is really wonderful. It's not a strong sweetness, but a hot and mellow aroma, like boiled liquor. I understand why it left you behind." Chaoxi only tasted the strong smell of blood and was extremely nauseous. Watching the beautiful young lady collapse onto the bed with no resistance, her bright lips half open and half closed, as if venting indescribable pain, the Count pressed his body lower, and his restless hand slid over her beautiful waistline, probing under her skirt. Chaoxi was stirred up with a shudder, her pupils contracting slightly, and she exclaimed in panic, "Bastard! What are you doing?" The Marquis chuckled and whispered in her ear, "What stupid words should I say? You should call me my master." She almost forgot that blood-race creatures are no different from wild beasts, and their appetite and sexual desire are always spontaneous. During the process of eating, they will force their prey to have sexual intercourse due to excitement. The Church had long been aware of this, and when Chaoxi took on the task, she assumed such a risk by default. She self-deprecatingly believed that the common people would always be common people, and even if they were dressed in elegant attire, their fate would not be the same as that of the noblewoman. Just treat it like being bitten by a dog, it's not a big deal. Just as the cold hand slid into the fragile and sensitive inner thigh, a familiar voice suddenly came from not far ahead. "Lord Kleos, someone is looking for you outside the palace." Chaoxi suddenly breathed a sigh of relief, and at the same time, Yu Guang looked towards the person who had met before. It was the Count who had previously met him, who caught him from the air and released his hand in a playful manner. Unlike before when his limbs were still healthy, in just a short while, one of his arms was missing, and his sleeve was torn apart by something, dripping blood and water. Chaoxi was slightly stunned. Who did he fight with? The Marquis of Kleos did not look back, but seemed to know what had happened and curled his lips with interest. "You came so fast." He lightly kissed Chaoxi's lips, as if coaxing his beloved pet, "Be good and wait for me to come back." The heavy weight weighing on her finally left, and in the blink of an eye, only Chaoxi was left in the room. Due to being paralyzed by saliva, Chaoxi couldn't exert any force all over her body. She struggled for a while before reluctantly sitting up, covering the wound that was still bleeding outside. She couldn't help but take a breath of cold air and curse loudly, "Damn." At this moment, outside the main hall, the blooming rose garden was stirred upside down by unexpected visitors, with rose petals shattered everywhere and thrown into the air like countless moths. That was a crazy wriggling lump of meat, constantly growing and reproducing, swallowing up everything it went. It was reasonable to say that the larger the object, the slower its movement, but it was completely opposite, with astonishing speed, charging straight towards the palace gate. The Marquis of Kleos appeared from the darkness and looked at the scene before him, but he raised his eyebrows in confusion and said, "Vivian hasn't come." Count Albert, who was following closely behind him, nodded and said, "Well, it was a subordinate of Vivian who was a glutton and killed directly from overseas. You know, the rest of us can't stop the flesh and blood." The Marquis did not seem to take it into his eyes, still struggling with the question he had just raised. "No, Albert, you don't know that guy. His brain, nerves, and possessiveness are a single string, and it's ready to explode." As he spoke, the massive chunks of flesh turned into sharp tentacles, targeting the heart of the newly emerged Marquis of Kleos. This blow did not succeed, but was forcefully caught by the Marquis with one hand, his sharp nails piercing into the flesh and blood, and the bright red blood slid down his bulging palm into his sleeve. Albert regained his senses and couldn't help but take a step back. He was indeed not a match for this monster, even though the other person's status was on par with his own. His killing nature seemed to have been ingrained in his bloodline since childhood, like a complete meat grinder. The disappearing right arm was bestowed upon it, and this madman couldn't stop it at all. He fought desperately to crawl into the main hall. What is there that makes it so persistent? Albert thought of the human girl just now and suddenly realized that the bite mark on her neck still had the aura of a blood marquee. It was taboo to covet prey from superiors, so he let go at that time. As a count, the gluttony stumbled upon Lord Cleos while he was enjoying his food, only receiving orders from his superiors. His superior was Marquis Vivian, so was the bite mark on the human girl left by Vivian. How could this thing leave a living mouth? Surprised, Albert found himself hiding behind the Marquis, which was outrageous. He was determined to rush forward, but was stopped by the Marquis. "No need, you can rest." As the words fell, the Marquis's body melted into a wriggling black shadow, attached to the tentacle, and burrowed straight into the massive flesh and blood, disappearing. Albert blinked again, and the massive piece of flesh instantly exploded into dense shreds, splattering everywhere. The Marquis appeared at the center of the flesh and blood, stepping on a shrunken, normal human-sized lump of flesh. It still wanted to resist, but unfortunately, the person who stepped on it didn't give it a chance. With one foot, it fell apart and could no longer merge together, and the minced meat became lifeless corpses. Albert silently swallowed, bowed in admiration to the Marquis. He was about to get up when inexplicable palpitations caused his pupils to contract and his hair to stand on end. This sense of death pressure had only been brought to him by the Marquis of Creus. The Marquis wants to kill himself. Impossible, unless it is suddenly looking up. I saw the Marquis of Cleos showing an extremely excited smile, his body transforming into a huge black shadow, surrounding the entire palace. At the same moment, screams of agony came from within the palace, accompanied by violent destruction. The walls and soil shattered, and the majestic palace collapsed. "It's here." Creo's laughter echoed inside and outside the palace. "Vivian, you've crossed the line." Feeling a trembling sensation from the earth's surface, Chaoxi, who had finally stood up against the wall, was about to fall because her legs couldn't exert enough force. Fortunately, she quickly grabbed the stone pillar next to her and saved herself from falling into a dog gnawing on the mud. "What are you doing outside? Are they fighting? Why does it look like an earthquake is imminent?" The cement on top of her head was heavily damaged and cracked, so staying here would be dangerous. Chaoxi could only try to control her disobedient legs and cautiously move to the side of the door. "Anyway, save your life first." She grabbed the door handle and opened the door. After seeing the scene outside the door, the whole person stood frozen in place. Plasma and severed limbs splattered in the sky, all from the blood race in the shadows. They were like ants crushed by wheels, unstoppable and flattened. The culprit that causes everything is the massive flesh and blood that emerges from the surface, like demons released from hell, indiscriminately killing all life wherever they go. At the moment when Chaoxi appeared, its movements were extremely accelerated, like a flood rushing through a dam, with a clear target. Damn it, before Chaoxi could even think of running, the beast-like flesh and blood had already rushed towards her, with a wide mouth full of fangs. The scene was so familiar that Chaoxi felt her heart skip a beat. That night, the silver-haired blood tribe she saved ate her in the same way. All thoughts were stuck in the scene before my eyes, and then, as expected, they were swallowed up again. In an instant it was pitch black in front of her, and the tremendous impact forced Chaoxi to cry out in pain. Her ears were buzzing incessantly, almost causing a concussion. Unlike that night when she fainted in extreme fear, she was exceptionally clear at this moment, feeling her body tightly wrapped in thick flesh and blood. The violent impact was constantly coming, and it was carrying itself recklessly, with a paranoid disregard for the lives of others. Chaoxi could only mournfully stir the river and the sea in those flesh and blood, calling out that every day should not respond and that the earth should not be spiritual. Creos watched with his own eyes as Vivian used his subordinates as bait, blatantly snatching the prey he had just obtained. He laughed instead of angry. What was this, a provocation? It was not intentional by Cleos. Watching the guy who wanted to run away after grabbing the person, Lord Marquis symbolically blocked it. The pitch-black shadow formed a surrounding trend on its inevitable escape path, entangled in its surging flesh and blood, and truly slowed its movement. Cleos joked and said, "Don't hurry, Prince Nosferatu has called you to tea." Communication is the biggest taboo when facing flesh and blood, especially when it comes to strange things like this. It is the best negative teaching material. For a moment of refreshment, Cleos was instantly hit by tentacles that broke half of his face, and his skull and brain were stained red on half of the sky. On the remaining half of his face, his smile gradually narrowed as he watched the flesh and blood break through the restriction and move further away. The shattered half of his face also unknowingly grew new flesh and blood. Wild single-celled creature, I hope the little one can survive tonight in its hands. Is Chapter 6 about it? You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chaoxi has undergone strict physical training and generally does not experience adverse reactions such as nausea and vomiting, unless it is truly unbearable. God knows how long she has been held hostage by this lump of meat, and she even suspects that she has been unconscious for a while, and when she wakes up again, she is still wrapped inside and moving. The flesh and blood are enclosed, and there is no supply of air, which can easily pose a risk of suffocation. This guy seems to be paying attention to the problem, and after a while, he will open the meat pieces, revealing small gaps to catch his breath. Chaoxi seized the opportunity to crawl through the gap and was caught by it, then guarded and closed it. She wanted to cry without tears. What kind of thing is this? Isn't it true that different clans are incompatible with water and fire? Why would a flesh and blood person openly appear in the realm of shadows? What does it want to do when it takes away itself? All the good plans have been disrupted, and now not only can't the task be completed, but also saving lives is a problem. Chaoxi didn't think he was a blessed person, able to dodge twice from under the fangs of flesh and blood. There seemed to be some details that she had overlooked, which would have been noticed quickly by the usual Chaoxi. However, now her mind is completely stirred up, except for palpitations and restlessness. Until it finally came to a stop, the flesh and blood that had imprisoned Chaoxi suddenly receded. Chaoxi, feeling dizzy, landed on the ground with both feet, not like stepping on the ground, but as soft as cotton. She could no longer hold on and fell to the ground with a thud, her stomach churning and retching. Unfortunately, she hasn't eaten anything for a long time, and her throat has been hanging a few times without spitting anything out, only drooling outside. Chaoxi almost forgot that there was even bigger trouble at the moment. Facing a marquis's flesh and blood. She was kneeling on the ground at this moment, her eyes turning red, and something was grabbing her wrist. She looked up in amazement, endless. Can we wait for her to finish vomiting first? Chaoxi was stunned. The massive flesh and blood monster shrank rapidly, and in the blink of an eye, it shrunk to the size of a human, revealing its true face. Surprisingly, he was a slender teenager with long silver hair draped haphazardly behind his head, and his face was impeccable in beauty. Chaoxi couldn't distinguish whether it was a man or a woman, with a tall nose bridge, deep eye sockets, a soft and beautiful facial contour, full lips but lacking blood color, more like lifeless porcelain. She had never seen such a beautiful face before, and was a bit lost in thought. When she realized it, she noticed that her crimson pupils, like those of other blood races, were dangerously shrinking into extremely thin vertical lines, staring at the bleeding bite mark on her neck like a venomous snake. The chill gradually spread from the back of her spine. How dare she forget that this was the most dangerous flesh and blood? It approached Chaoxi's wound and sniffed with its nose, as if it had smelled something. Suddenly, it let out a hoarse growl from its throat, like a wild beast discovering that its prey had been contaminated with the scent of others. Does Chaoxi's scalp tingle and there is any odor on her neck, the scent left by the mark of the blood clan Marquis Creos? Before she could figure it out, this guy took a bite and his sharp fangs accurately bit towards her wound. The pain made Chaoxi scream, his lips tremble, and he couldn't speak. Can these crazy people bite in a different place? This force was really fierce, and Chaoxi suspected that it was extremely hungry, so she wanted to tear off the meat and fill her stomach first. And then, there was no more. The pain combined with excessive blood loss caused a blackout in front of me, and I passed out like this. In her dream, she seemed to have lived in her childhood, with a heavy workload of enslavement. Every day, she not only had to wash clothes, deal with dirty feces, clean luxurious homes, but also accompanied the impulsive aristocratic masters as toys for leisure. At that time, the aristocrats who served were popular in the game called Blood Hunt. They made slaves wear silver-white fur to act as vampires, and these people who disguised themselves as blood clans were imprisoned in carefully planned jungles. The aristocratic masters rode horses and hunted with hunting rifles from behind, while they ran desperately in front. Wherever they fled, it was a fate to be shattered by traps in the jungle or pierced in the chest by bullets from behind. Chaoxi's life was hard, but a copper coin hanging around her neck blocked the bullet. She lay on the ground pretending to be dead in order to survive. She ran away and was about to starve to death on the street because she didn't eat or drink. She had to go back again, only to realize later that wherever she ran away, it was the same, and she could only be treated as a slave to others for beating and scolding. Those nobles are really interesting, pretending to be bloodthirsty while hunting for pleasure. When they encounter a vampire, they are so scared that they look like a king huddled in a turtle shell. Chaoxi saw a living vampire for the first time, and I don't know where those people discovered it. The weak silver-haired blood tribe hid in the weeds, seemingly seriously injured and without any fighting ability. The old masters panicked and shouted for people to tie it up in all sorts of ways, burning it, beheading it, and sinking it into a river, using all means possible but unable to kill it. I heard it was afraid of the sun, but at that time it was already at sunset, so I had to nail it on a wooden cross until the sun rose again tomorrow. They needed someone to stay guard all night to prevent the vampires from escaping. At that time, Chaoxi was dragged into the carriage and taken to the front of the silver-haired blood tribe. Recalling that night's blood race, its skin and flesh were burnt black and its appearance was indistinct, except for its silver hair shining brightly under the moonlight. Its body shape seemed to be not robust, similar to that of a human teenager of 16 or 17 years old. Chaoxi looked at its blood-red pupils, and its blood-flesh blurred face gradually became clear. The blood-flesh wriggled and repaired the necrotic skin. Under the moonlight, an unreal and beautiful face appeared. This face looks a bit familiar. Chaoxi woke up from her coma, not knowing how long it had been. The light was dim, unable to distinguish between day and night. She saw the decaying ceiling, without chandeliers, only adorned with mottled dark red bloodstains. Where is she? In the stable where inferior slaves sleep. A large storefront in a church branch. The villa where the noblewoman resides. Obviously not at all. Chaoxi remembers being caught by a shadow, and what happened there was a piercing pain in her head, and she couldn't help but frown. She rubbed her temples while habitually getting up and out of bed. It seemed like something had been stepped on under my feet, soft and still moving. Looking down, my dazed consciousness suddenly woke up. Surprisingly, it's a bloody piece of meat. Not only under their feet, but everywhere on the ground, they seem to grow on the ground, connected to wooden boards, slowly wriggling, as if breathing regularly. Chaoxi looked around again, on the walls, on the table, on the wardrobe, and even on the bed she had just woken up. These pieces of meat were everywhere, integrated with the entire building. She remembered everything when a flesh and blood person suddenly broke into the shadows' territory and forcibly took her away. Before she could figure out what was going on, she was bitten lightly by that guy and fainted. So she's now taken to the territory of the flesh and blood. The current eerie scene may indeed be so. Chaoxi's expression became particularly complicated, and she didn't know for a moment whether to be grateful for her life or to have a headache when she encountered the most difficult person to deal with. How could he be targeted by flesh and blood, or by a marquis? According to the Church's evaluation of the danger level of the blood race, when encountering a blood and flesh count or above, there is no need to do anything. Just find a comfortable position and pray for the pain of death to be faster. Why would a marquis of flesh and blood disregard the rules of the blood race to cross the border and seize a human? This is really unbelievable. It's a marquis, why hasn't a young and beautiful human blood servant delivered it to your door? Wait, Chaoxi's pupils gradually contracted, and she remembered the blood and flesh blurred face of the blood tribe she had saved, overlapping with the face of the marquis's flesh and blood figure who had been startled before falling into a coma. Similar body shape, equally silver-white long hair, and such a coincidence are all flesh and blood. There are inevitably too many coincidences. Could it be that the one who took away his own marquis's flesh and blood was the blood clan who had a chance encounter and rescued him in the past? Chaoxi couldn't be certain that the blood clan of that night had been ravaged to the point where they couldn't see their appearance clearly, but if that were the case, it would all make sense. Back then, it left bite marks on its neck, which was actually a mark on her. That's why a count wanted to bite her before suddenly stopping, because there were clear rules among the blood clan that those under the title coveted the prey of those above it, which was considered illegal. Killing without the permission of those above it was like seeking death. But Krios, who was also a marquis, did not need to be taboo. He marked Chaoxi as at most despicable and wanted to provoke others. No wonder they openly crossed the line and robbed people from afar, and even demolished their homes. Recalling the inexplicable words spoken by Krios, Chaoxi understood them clearly. What little rabbit can't find its home? Say hello to it for me. Krios knew from the beginning that someone of the same race had marked her, so he bit it down. That idiot caused herself to be bitten 3 times in the same position, especially the infuriated flesh and blood person, who almost didn't bite her head off with one bite. Neither of them can run away with this account, they will have to repay it sooner or later. With this in mind, Chaoxi couldn't help but touch her neck, wanting to see what it had been chewed on now and whether it was completely unrecognizable. Fingers touching the skin unexpectedly did not feel any pain, and not only that, even the tissue growth that had been left behind was gone, smooth as if it had never been damaged. She was shocked and uncertain as she changed her hand to touch it, but still couldn't feel the scar, which was even more strange. There is an explanation why scars disappear inexplicably. Blood-flesh individuals have an ability to help them recover irreversible limb injuries, such as scar repair or limb regeneration. This rumor is too bizarre, because flesh and blood have no reason to help the food in their eyes, and humans cannot experiment whether this claim is true or false. They have no way to communicate and listen to any coercion or temptation. Previously, Chaoxi thought it was some boring guy spreading rumors, but now she has been shaken. Apart from this explanation, she can't think of anything else. Is that jealous guy really flesh and blood? Not only did she let herself go for the second time, but she also helped her heal her scar and restrained her nature to achieve this level, just because she let it go back then. When did flesh and blood become so amiable? Of course, there's nothing wrong with it. In a place full of vampires, there's a seemingly grateful marquis flesh and blood to support her, which can be a good way of life. Chapter 7. Maintenance and Security. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Looking around, this place is very similar to the palaces inhabited by human nobles, both in terms of decoration and layout, as if intentionally copying human lifestyles. The appearance has been neglected for a long time, with dust everywhere and outdated furniture and decorations. There is no oil in kerosene lamps, no flowers in vases, and no clothes in wardrobes. This seems like a forgotten abandoned place, with no traces of life, only mottled bloodstains and eerie flesh tentacles. Such a scene would seem terrifying anywhere, but it should be noted that the people living here are a group of flesh and blood, so it looks reasonable, worthy of the aristocratic style and the eerie and curious style itself. I didn't expect flesh and blood to also save face. Chaoxi adjusted her emotions, carefully bypassed the meat pieces on the ground, opened the bedroom door, and walked out. Regardless of whether it is good or evil, meeting it will naturally lead to meeting the true chapter. Outside the door is a deep corridor, with decorative wall lamps hanging on the walls. None of them are lit, only the faint moonlight pouring in from the window, illuminating the road ahead. Chaoxi walked along the corridor, and the scene in front of her reappeared, quickly losing her sense of direction. This place is also too big, and the rooms are one after another, with similar decorations. After wandering around with dark lights in the morning, I didn't encounter a blood tribe. The vast palace is quiet, with only my own breath and footsteps echoing in my ears. Her nerves tightened into a thread, and she couldn't help but start brainstorming whether a terrifying ghost would suddenly appear to scare people. Whatever you want, you can do it. A cold touch came from your wrist, and something sticky and soft was grabbed. With a stirring moment, Chaoxi quickly shook off the object in her hand. Looking at it, there was a tentacle that had emerged from the ground. After being thrown away, it did not rush forward frantically, but retreated back as if it had been hit hard, and then wriggled in one direction. Seeing that Chaoxi didn't keep up, it stopped and twisted its soft body in a circle. Chaoxi is uncertain and uncertain. What does it mean? Keep up with it. So Chaoxi took 2 steps towards it, and as expected, it continued to wriggle. Perhaps the owner here couldn't stand her circling in place and letting it guide her. After thinking for a moment, Chaoxi decided to follow along. Where is it taking itself? The answer to this doubt quickly came, and the field of vision was suddenly wide. In front of Chaoxi was a dining table that was more than 10 meters long, with a dazzling array of plates placed on it. Deep red roses adorned the vase, and a warm yellow candlelight illuminated the food on the table. Surprisingly, it was raw meat still emitting blood. Chaoxi's mouth twitched, and the tentacle saw her standing still. It pushed the high-backed chair aside, as if saying why not sit over. Chaoxi hasn't eaten anything for a long time, but she wouldn't be so hungry that she would eat raw meat that was peeled alive from an unknown animal on a table. Seeing that she still hadn't moved, a tentacle emerged from behind and pushed her back towards the dining table. Unable to resist, Chaoxi sat down on the chair, looking down at the flesh with nerve fibers still beating, his eyelids twitching. Are you joking? Even if it's cooked, who knows if these meats are cut from humans? She doesn't have a habit of eating the same kind. Chaoxi remained motionless, and the tentacles swayed back and forth as if at a loss. Soon, she climbed onto the table again, rolled up a piece of meat in front of her, swallowed it, and pushed the other piece along with the plate to her side. What does this mean? Chaoxi was a bit puzzled. After thinking for a while, could it be that she thought the reason she didn't eat it was because she was afraid of the poison inside? After a moment of silence, she picked up a knife and fork with a complex expression, picked up a piece of meat with a distinct sheepskin smell, cut it into a small piece and put it close to her mouth. After hesitating for a moment, she still put it into her mouth. The strong fishy smell filled my nose, and my eyebrows were almost twisted into a Chinese character. I suppressed the thought of nausea and chewed it twice before eagerly swallowing it. There's nothing wrong with it, just ordinary fresh lamb. Regardless of its appearance and taste, it can be considered a highly nutritious food. Since there was a beginning, Chaoxi overcame her psychological barriers and continued to eat, comforting herself that what she could eat was better than starving here. After eating a plate of food, Chaoxi couldn't help but shed 2 tears from the fish. Knives and forks collided in the quiet night, and the tentacles unconsciously drew closer and closer to Chaoxi. As she turned her head, she happened to look at it in the eye, and it stopped like a child being caught. Chaoxi did not reflexively shake him off like before, her black eyes reflecting on the flames fixed on it, nor did she resist its approach. This undoubtedly gave the other party more courage. They moved closer again, approached Chaoxi's hand, touched her skin, and slowly wrapped around her fingertips, stuffing a hard object into her palm. Chaoxi was slightly stunned and opened her palm. On top of it lay half a copper coin with the design of the city of Chloe. She still remembers this copper coin, which was hanging around her neck while serving as a servant for those nobles. Why is it missing half? It's because when she participated in blood hunting, in order to survive, Chaoxi dodged bullets in the midst of gunfire and bullets. Unfortunately, a bullet hit this copper coin, and she escaped a disaster as a result. Later, the Blood Clan attacked the town, and this copper coin was also lost. I didn't expect to be here. Chaoxi looked at the retracted tentacles with a complex expression, wanting to tell Chaoxi something. Was it the vampire nailed to the cross back then? My inner speculation has been firmly confirmed at this moment. It really marked itself back then, and it was for this reason that it broke into the territory of other blood races to steal people. With mixed emotions, Chaoxi responded softly, "It's you." Upon hearing the desire to respond, even without any facial features, the tentacles couldn't conceal their joy. Its body rapidly expanded, its flesh and blood surged, and it transformed into a person. Seeing that incredibly beautiful face again, with a slender figure wearing a stiff formal dress and silver long hair draped over her shoulders, Chaoxi's heart still missed a beat. It is like a child on a moonlit night, pure and flawless, making one unable to help but feel pity. Taking a deep breath in secret, "Chaoxi, you are a useless person. As a professional blood demon hunter, you must always remain calm and use deceitful tactics, which are despicable means of the Blood Clan." It approached without any sense of boundaries, and Chaoxi couldn't help but lean back in the chair, unable to avoid it. It pressed its hand against its chest, its crimson pupils focused on Chaoxi, and its lips parted, saying, "Vivian." The tone is very formal, just like when learning a foreign language, there are some rigid and precise tones, indicating that it is not good at human language. After speaking, it turned its finger towards Chaoxi again, and curiosity emerged from its crimson pupils. Chaoxi was stunned for a moment. Did it just say her own name? Now she wants to ask her name. Chaoxi. Vivian repeated her words, "Chaoxi." Slowly holding on to Chaoxi's hand, he approached again and said, "I lost you. Fortunately, I found it." It was almost pressed against Chaoxi's body, and as she spoke, her gaze was fixed on the previously scarred area of her neck. Even though there were no visible traces now, a certain despicable scent of blood could still be faintly smelled. So Vivian's voice became eerie and gloomy, "No one wants to take you away." Chaoxi Limbu Ding was startled by the tone of this sentence, trembling all over her body. She was worried that it would go crazy again and take a bite at her neck. Only then did she realize that she was getting too close and immediately withdrew her hand to step back. "I'm really obsessed, but I actually think it's innocent and harmless. This face is really harmful to people." Chaoxi reflected on her mistakes and stubbornly defended herself, which was definitely not superficial. She had seen many good-looking people before, but it was really the first time she had met someone like this. Her resistance made Vivian, who had a bit of courage, vent his anger and then transformed into an immature tentacle hiding in the crevices of the floor. Chaoxi's thinking has become chaotic again. Why does she look even more afraid of the other person than herself? Is there a mistake? It's the vampire, shouldn't it be oneself who should be worried? You hesitated to speak. It seemed to be stimulated by some kind of stimulation, with flesh and blood surging and swelling, and even spitting out a pile of jewelry from its body. Various gemstones, including intricately crafted gold and lustrous jade, shimmered brilliantly at first glance. Chaoxi had never said what kind of gentleman he was. Being swayed by the colorful light made his body and mind ripple. He thought it was worth diving in and suffocating, but now it's different. The more tempting things are, the more dangerous they are. It's important to remain calm. God knows how much endurance she has to maintain her expressionless expression. Here you are. The tentacles pushed the jewelry in front of her, causing it to crash all over the ground. Whatever you want, I'll give it to you. Chaoxi saw a pearl earring rolling towards her feet, with a warm white body stained with dark red blood. The other one fell into this pile of jewelry or onto the body of a noblewoman. Her face looked ugly, and she took a few more steps back. Did these all come from the girl who died under it? Did the girls from before also be brought here and fed up when they got tired of playing? This is in line with the spleen of flesh and blood. Chaoxi's resistance further stimulated the flesh and blood. It wriggled frantically and quickly climbed up to clean the table. Its massive body swept down the dishes on the ground, grabbed a handful of roses from the vase, and then lifted it high in front of Chaoxi. Seeing it approaching, Chaoxi instinctively wanted to retreat or run away without looking back, but this would undoubtedly further anger the elusive Marquis. She could only force herself to hold back and watch it gradually approach. Looking at the deep red rose, she knew that this was not the time to anger it. She wanted to gain the trust of this guy, and the task was the most important. So she held back her emotions and carefully reached out to take the flowers. Her fingers touched the cold tentacles, and it greedily rubbed against the soft skin of Chaoxi before reluctantly retracting. Vivian's voice came from her tentacles. Chaoxi, don't be afraid of me. I like you. Chaoxi's fingers burned as if she had been pricked by the thorn of a rose. She could no longer hold her expression, and the bouquet fell to the ground. What the hell is this? It's completely different from what was agreed upon, which flesh and blood person would wonder like this. At a young age, others don't learn well. Do you know what your prince is doing now? Chapter 8. Eating is a top priority. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The Palace of Vivian is very grand, with 10 floors up and down, each with at least 3 halls, several restaurants, and countless rooms. Just by walking around the bottom floor, Chaoxi's legs were already a bit tired. Not to mention that there are still 9 floors up there. After getting familiar with everything, I almost collapsed on the bed. And in such a huge palace, apart from Vivian, no other blood race has been encountered. Are they all hiding? Just like the shadows of the blood race can hide in the darkness, they also hide in the ubiquitous flesh in the palace. This idea was not overturned until a long time later, as flesh and blood have a strong sense of territory, and even their close subordinates cannot break into the territory of others. The flesh and tentacles sticking to the walls and floors are actually Vivian's flesh and blood, equivalent to Vivian's eyes and claws, monitoring every move in this hall. Chaoxi will be living with a flesh and blood person next, maybe for a few months, maybe a few years, maybe even longer, depending on when the church will let her go back. There is an urgent need to solve a problem at the moment. The long table in the restaurant is filled with various types of meat, which may have been prepared by Vivian for her, but there is a serious problem. They are all raw and Vivian doesn't know how to cook delicious food. Or in other words, it seems to have no idea how to raise human blood servants. The arrival of Chaoxi was like an unexpected surprise. It was preparing in a hurry and had no idea how humans should live. Unfortunately, there is no other bloodline in the entire palace except for it. Chaoxi cannot eat raw meat every day. If she wants to change the situation, she can only do it herself. After circling around the palace, Chaoxi finally found the kitchen, covered her mouth and nose, swept away the dust on the stove, and squatted down to look inside. Apart from accumulating a thick layer of ash, only firewood was missing. Sure enough. Perhaps she could ask the owner here. There was no one around, and only a faint candlelight flickered in the dim kitchen. Vivian's figure could not be seen, but Chaoxi inexplicably had a premonition that it was everywhere. Is there firewood and charcoal here? She asked into the darkness. As expected, a large ball of flesh and blood surged out of the open ground, and these irregular flesh and blood gathered into the appearance of a 16 or 17-year-old human, dressed neatly and with a stunning appearance. Are flesh and blood beings so elusive? They can melt into flesh and blood in an instant, burrow into the ground, and emerge again from anywhere. Wherever there is minced meat attached, there is its trace. It seems that Chaoxi needs to try to get used to its way of action. Vivian's crimson pupils looked at her inexplicably. 4 eyes met each other, but the other person didn't speak for a long time. Chaoxi understood clearly that it might not understand and gave up seeking help. After searching for a while, she brought a few velvet cloth high-backed chairs decorated with gemstones, rolled up her sleeves 3 times and divided them into 2, dismantled useful wood, threw it into the stove, and carefully placed the valuable gemstones next to it. Then she picked up another one and dismantled it. Vivian looked at it and seemed to understand her meaning. Gradually, huge tentacles gathered on the ground and suddenly swung towards the chairs, causing the sawdust to fly and only be shattered in an instant. Looking at the fragments handed over, Chaoxi awkwardly and politely threw them into the stove. It should be almost done now. She picked up the pre-prepared flame and ignited the sawdust, and the faint spark quickly became more and more intense with her actions, and the surroundings began to heat up. Chaoxi's figure began to become skillfully busy, and after more than a decade as a servant, she still had this skill. Not to mention how delicious it was, at least she could definitely not waste food. There are all kinds of kitchen utensils hanging on the kitchen wall, but not even the most basic seasonings. After searching around, only a small can of salt was found in the corner. I hope it can still be used. I originally wanted to use a pot to boil water and stew, but due to the pitiful lack of seasoning, I moved the iron pot away, put iron skewers on the skinned lamb legs, and grill them over the fire. The waiting time was long. Chaoxi had eaten less in the past few days and was already so hungry that her chest pressed against her back. Her nasal cavity quickly sensed the fragrance of meat, and she couldn't help but swallow it in her throat. Wait a little longer, she's not familiar yet. She realizes that this temptation is not a big deal. A loud "guru" came from her ear, and Chaoxi instinctively touched her lower abdomen, flat and quiet, not like it was emitted by herself. So she looked at another person and saw Vivian's blood-red eyes staring without blinking at the leg of the lamb perched on the iron stick. The jumping firelight reflected her pale and exquisite features, and there seemed to be crystal-clear liquid flowing from the corner of her mouth. She surprisingly made such an indescribable expression with such a beautiful face, an indescribable waist. When Chaoxi regained his senses, he walked up to the stove at an unknown time and wanted to take lamb legs from the fire with his bare hands. He was so surprised that Chaoxi immediately grabbed its back collar and pulled it back. "Are you crazy? Is it not afraid of scalding?" "It seems like I'm really not afraid. It is flesh and blood," and Chaoxi is speechless. How could it automatically bring it into adult children? The interrupted Vivian's crimson eyes were filled with fierce anger, but upon hearing the other person's voice, his erect pupils relaxed and he looked at Chaoxi, swallowing in confusion. Staring down by those innocent eyes, Chaoxi struggled to move her gaze away, sprinkled salt, and cut a piece of meat with a small knife, which was a bit hot. After blowing for a while, she used her 2 fingers to drive it to the front. "Do you want to try it?" Vivian stared at her reddened fingertips, his eyes darkening. He didn't take it with his hand, but directly bit it in. His long and pointed tongue curled up the piece of meat and sent it into his stomach. I don't know if it was intentional, but my tongue licked her fingers tenderly, and my sharp fangs seemed to be itching uncontrollably, rubbing against her fingertips. Chaoxi was startled and immediately withdrew his hand. The crystal-clear saliva was also stretched, forming a delicate silver thread, which then broke. "It's so close, I almost got my fingers bitten." Vivian stared intently at her red fingertips, as if unsatisfied with just a few sips and about to approach her. At this moment, the food sucked into her stomach began to take effect, frantically stirring up its gastric juice. The crimson pupils once again turned into vertical lines, staring ferociously at the remaining leg of the lamb. If the gaze was a knife, the poor leg of the lamb would probably have been cut by countless knives. Chaoxi wiped the saliva from her fingertips and raised her eyebrows to look at its reaction. It seemed that the taste of grilled meat had led the savage little one to discover the new world. The condition was almost over, and she took off the leg of the lamb. The burnt yellow flesh kept flowing out with juice, and the meat was fragrant all over. There are 2 in total, one for oneself and the other for Vivian. Chaoxi was already starving, taking a big bite and stuffing it into her mouth. The oil slid down her lips and teeth, wetting her rosy lips. She squinted her eyes with satisfaction, and sure enough, everything she did had to rely on herself. Will eating such oily food suddenly cause bloating? No matter what, it's all roasted. Let's eat until we're full. Before taking a bite, I looked at Vivian at first glance and realized that half of the leg she had given her was missing, not to mention the bones. The iron swab worn on it was also gone. Chaoxi widened her eyes. That's just a whole leg of lamb, and in the blink of an eye, it's gone. Facing those crimson eyes, it quickly engraved the 3 words, "Still want," on its face, and its tongue dangerously licked its lips. "I want you to chop some more wood," said Chaoxi, silently protecting her lamb leg behind her and pointing to the chair next to her that narrowly escaped the disaster so the other person didn't say a word, and their body melted into flesh and blood before their eyes. Immediately after, there was a fierce roar in the direction of the hall not far away. She seemed to hear the sound of a pile of things breaking apart, and couldn't help but walk to the door and look out. The hall has turned into a mess, and the culprit is wriggling huge flesh and blood, with furniture-filled corpses presented to Chaoxi. She couldn't help but twitch at the corners of her mouth, secretly cursing the scumbag and making a fire, which would cost her a lot of money. No, Chaoxi had to do what she said, but she didn't expect this guy to be so delicious. The grilled meat was mercilessly swallowed before it had a chance to show off its seductive golden beauty. That plump and beautiful lip actually cracked with a large bleeding opening, and its features were instantly ferocious. After devouring it, it returned to its elegant human appearance. She knew how this guy suddenly ate the leg of a lamb that was even bigger than its head. Chaoxi grilled a piece and swallowed it. How could that slender 16 or 17-year-old body hold so much? After a whole day, there was no movement in her lower abdomen, even as if she had been starving for several days. She finally realized a truth that this guy couldn't eat enough. Even if it kept eating until half of the coffin was buried in the ground, it wouldn't be a problem. After all, she had seen its massive body that had proliferated infinitely, and it was easy to swallow the entire palace in one gulp. So Chaoxi abandoned the task and gave up. Vivian stopped working and grabbed her arm to prevent her from leaving. She looked at the raw meat that had not yet been roasted, and anxiously said, "Chaoxi, I'm not full." Looking at its shiny mouth, Chaoxi couldn't help but feel angry and wanted to laugh. It was a sin, so it shouldn't have opened the door to a new world and caused trouble for itself. Chaoxi firmly withdrew her hand and didn't look at its harmless face. "I'm full," she said, Chaoxi. It gently wrapped its tentacles around Chaoxi's ankle, but to her surprise, she was so heartless that she pulled out the entangled ankle again. Chaoxi thought to herself that her courage was getting stronger and stronger. She dared to refuse a request from a flesh and blood person. Aren't she not afraid of making it angry or being devoured alive? As expected, Vivian was in a fit of anger, feeling dejected and then burrowed back into the ground. Although it was unbelievable, Chaoxi had to admit that Vivian really wouldn't harm herself. During this period of time spent together, she was also convinced of her own views. In order to further understand this strange guy, Chaoxi dared to gradually test him. The issue of food and clothing was temporarily resolved, so Chaoxi shifted her attention to hygiene issues. It's not that the palace is dirty and messy. In fact, compared to the slums where I lived in my childhood, this place can be considered very good. The problem is that the entire palace is like a newly renovated empty shell, gorgeous, but all the necessary daily necessities cannot be found. The flesh and blood person doesn't need to cook, take a shower, or do anything, but Chaoxi is a human and a lack of daily necessities will make her very uncomfortable. The first solution that Chaoxi thought of was to exchange expensive gemstones that could be seen everywhere in the palace for what she needed. But the problem is who to exchange with. She only knows Vivian in the dangerous flesh and blood territory, and leaving her side recklessly may pose unknown dangers. Moreover, does the territory of flesh and blood really have the necessary supplies for human life? Will there be humans risking their lives to come to the territory of flesh and blood to buy and sell goods? Obviously, this is impossible. Even if Chaoxi carried a basket of gemstones and dug 3 feet in this territory, she would not find what she wanted. It seems that she can only pin her hope on Vivian. Vivian. As soon as she finished speaking, a cold touch came from her wrist, and a fair and slender hand gently tugged at her. Even though she was accustomed to its elusive way, Chaoxi was still surprised, withdrew her hand, and calmly distanced herself. You said before, I'll give me whatever I want, is that true? Vivian's eyes lit up slightly and he nodded. After pondering for a moment, Chaoxi listed some urgently needed items and how much they needed, and told them one by one. However, the other party stared at her blankly with their eyes open, and seeing this expression, they knew they didn't understand at all. Chaoxi frowned with a headache, wondering what to do. Vivian didn't even understand the meaning of these words. After pondering for a while, she suddenly came up with a solution. She searched around the palace and luckily found paper, pens, and ink in the study. Apply and wipe on the paper, and finally hand it over to Vivian, explaining, I want these things drawn on the paper. Chaoxi is still somewhat confident in her painting skills. When working in the homes of those aristocratic masters, she often hears professional oil painting teachers explaining courses to the ladies, and she also eavesdrops outside the door. Just this little confidence was quickly shattered when I saw Vivian holding the paper and looking back and forth upside down, left and right, pursing her lips to herself. This was definitely not her problem. Although Vivian's face was still confused, he nodded seriously. His body melted into wriggling flesh and was about to burrow into the ground, but was suddenly stopped by Chaoxi. Wait a moment. She handed over a few gemstones of average quality. Don't grab them, exchange them for this one. The wriggling flesh froze for a moment, obediently extending its tentacles and engulfing all the gemstones into its body, quickly disappearing with what Chaoxi had given it. I'm not sure how Vivian is going to get those things. If it's a robbery, it might even lead to a murder case. She has become the culprit, and it's best not to have such a thing happen. Chapter 9. Preliminary understanding of it. You are listening at novelfull.audio. After giving instructions, Chaoxi shifted her thoughts to the messy palace. Where should she start cleaning up first? Ashes were everywhere, including the bed she lay on when she woke up, with reddish-brown bloodstains sticking to the bedding, emitting an unbearable stench. Has Vivian never taken care of its palace? Chaoxi had never lived in such a corrupt and dirty place for a long time, and she almost forgot that she had also walked out of the foul-smelling slums. In the past, living in a dirty place was a no choice, but now it's different and she can make some changes. So let's start from the room she woke up in. Chaoxi rolled up her sleeves, used a wooden bucket to fetch water, removed all the curtains and bedding in the room, and soaked them in a water bucket. The clear water quickly dissolved into the stains, becoming turbid. She walked barefoot back and forth in the water several times, changed the bucket of water, and filtered it for the second time. The water was still turbid and unable to filter. Chaoxi had to wash back and forth several times before barely washing away some of the stains. No, these old stains can't be washed away with water alone, just soap is enough. As Chaoxi thought this, she suddenly felt the flesh around her wriggling violently. They gradually gathered together and were about to touch the chandelier above her head before stopping. She looked at the huge object in front of her, still in shock, only to see it suddenly crack open from the middle, with a flurry of debris pouring out of her body and falling around, quickly filling the small room. Among them, Chaoxi explained to Vivian what she was looking for, and more were strange things that she herself couldn't understand. Are these what she asked Vivian to bring back? Why don't I remember so much? Vivian has only been away for a long time. Where did he find these messy things so quickly? Chaoxi couldn't help but wonder if it really had a peaceful exchange of goods according to its own intentions. For a moment, Chaoxi didn't know whether to be pleasantly surprised by its ability to handle things or to worry about causing some trouble. Amidst the pile of clutter, a delicate and fair face emerged. It silently scrutinized Chaoxi with its blood-red pupils, seeming to want to see a satisfied expression on her face. Chaoxi noticed someone secretly observing her, sighed to herself, and forced a smile at it. "Okay, thank you anyway." The palace quickly became busy, with the figure of Chaoxi constantly running around. The water in the wooden bucket was changed one after another, and after sprinkling, the floor was mopped, the walls and furniture were cleaned, and items were sorted neatly. Unuseful items were first piled up in the neighboring room. Vivian also wriggled his flesh and blood as he followed her feet, watching her move items around and stirring a stick on the ground. Even if he didn't pay attention, he would step on it. For Chaoxi, who has been in the industry for over a decade and has received strict training in the church, these things are at her fingertips. However, it is inevitable that she will be too busy to tidy up such a large place alone. The bucket in her hand suddenly became lighter, and she paused slightly. Looking down, she saw a tentacle tentatively dragging the bottom of the bucket, wriggling in the direction of her movement. Chaoxi stopped, and it also stopped. Is it trying to help? So Chaoxi released her grip on the barrel and took a few steps forward to widen the distance. Vivian hesitated for a moment and followed with a bucket. This made her eyes suddenly brighten, and her gaze shifted to other eager tentacles on the side. A novel idea kept emerging in her mind. She brought the mop over, washed it in the bucket, and demonstrated how to mop the floor as simply and clearly as possible. Then, she handed the mop to the nearby tentacles. The tentacle took the mop, inexplicably holding it still. Chaoxi was patient and pointed to the bucket. It seemed to understand and learned how to stir the mop into the water. Then, she took it out and slammed the end of the mop onto the floor, rubbing it. Chaoxi couldn't help but burst out laughing, and upon hearing the sound, her tentacles were about to retract into the crevices of the ground. Fortunately, Chaoxi quickly stopped it and said, "Hey, that's it. It's done very well. It's outrageous to dare to mock the Marquis's ridiculous mopping posture." Chaoxi conducted a profound self-reflection. Unexpectedly, the flesh and blood person had a strong learning ability. Dragging and dragging made them appear more and more skilled, and their movements became more and more skilled. Chaoxi corrected their movements at the right time, as if hearing great praise, and the more they dragged and dragged, the more energetic they became. My gaze turned to the other tentacles again, as if they were joining in the fun and approaching one after another. Little did I know that someone's mouth was suspiciously raised. Now, not only Chaoxi is busy. A strange phenomenon appeared inside the palace, with more than 10 tentacles wriggling anxiously, dragging the ground with stiff movements, or rubbing clothes with their slippery bodies, or holding brushes to clean the dirt on the walls. This is definitely not squeezing free labor. It's already Vivian's palace, it's not excessive to let it clean up. Chaoxi didn't stop to rest, directing the little ones to perform their respective duties while teaching more trivial matters on site. The work that originally required more than 10 days ended in just a few hours. Looking up and down at the newly renovated hall, Chaoxi squinted her eyes with satisfaction, which was quite similar. I can't remember how long ago I took a shower, and there was a noticeable smell on my body. After some exercise, the sweat had soaked through the thin fabric on my back. Chaoxi couldn't wait to take a shower. There is a shared bathtub in the palace, with a circular bathtub that is over 10 meters long. At first glance, it can almost accommodate dozens of people, but unfortunately, the water inside has already dried up, and it will take a lot of time to fill the pool. Chaoxi took a shower alone. There was no need to be so extravagant. After thinking for a moment, she decided to use a wooden bucket that was half a person tall instead. Boiling a few pots of hot water would be enough. Not long after, a soothing mist swirled in the air, and Chaoxi took off her clothes and soaked them in a wooden bucket. The water temperature was slightly hot, just enough to arouse a sense of relaxation and fatigue. She took a comfortable long breath, wrapped her arms around her hands, and lay on the edge of the wooden bucket enjoying a brief moment of tranquility. In the hazy mist, a slight call shattered the quiet atmosphere and also brought her divergent thoughts back together. Chaoxi. It's Vivian's voice, coming from a very close distance. Her face changed, and she instinctively shrank her body into the water. At this moment, she was naked, although she didn't think she was too conservative, being seen by a stranger. It could also be a woman, no, not even a human. No one could calmly accept it. It seems a bit strange to hear the vibration of the sound, not like it's in the air, but rather like it's in water. A cold touch came from her calves, as if something was expanding in the water. Coincidentally, the water level line of her collarbone was rapidly soaring, causing her pupils to suddenly shrink. An ominous premonition struck her heart. In an instant, water splashed everywhere in the barrel, and surging flesh and blood emerged, condensing into a human body. It still wore a dignified and straight dress, with silver-white long hair scattered behind its head, and a delicate face that was indistinguishable between men and women. The splashing water wet its dress and hair, and water droplets dripped down its chin, coincidentally hitting the plump chest of Chaoxi. Vivian actually sat on her with her legs crossed. Chaoxi immediately covered her chest, clamped her legs tightly, and the wooden bucket was so big that it was barely enough to hold Chaoxi. Suddenly, a sense of security emerged, with her lower abdomen tightly pressed against her, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't distance herself. With her eyes facing each other, Chaoxi couldn't control her heartbeat and her voice was a bit flustered. "What are you doing?" The crimson pupils stared at the throbbing veins around her neck, and Chaoxi saw it swallowing saliva impatiently, as if tempted to be almost uncontrollable. Vivian's voice also seemed to be moistened by the mist. "Chaoxi, I'm thirsty." As it spoke, it dangerously bent down and its nose leaned closer to its eyes, gradually climbing up the bright and rosy neck. It smelled the faint fragrance, and a dangerous aura swam up from its spine. Chaoxi was tense all over, perhaps due to the scorching hot water that accelerated her blood flow, dilated her pores, and the rich taste was like an inducer, stimulating the blood race who already had an exceptionally keen sense of smell. Having been cruelly and almost gnawed twice by Vivian, she had some psychological trauma. Would she want to bite 2 blood holes in her neck like before? Chaoxi pursed her lower lip tightly, suppressing the desire to escape. She knew better than anyone that once she escaped, there would be another time. As a blood servant, she had to be mentally prepared for long-term bloodsucking. Vivian didn't take a bite for a long time. It looked at the throbbing muscles around its neck and the frowning brows of Chaoxi due to resistance, seeming very conflicted. After waiting for a moment, Chaoxi finally realized something was wrong. Looking at Vivian's face that was close at hand, why didn't it bite? "Chaoxi." It spoke again with a sincere voice, "I'm thirsty." Chaoxi was momentarily stunned. Was it asking for her opinion? For the first time, she had never imagined encountering such a situation where a blood clan was seeking her consent to vampire. Facing the hesitant blood pupils, Chaoxi's brain twitched. Instead of pushing it away, she reached out and pressed its head against her neck. "I understand." Chaoxi seemed to feel her entire body excited, and for a moment, the long-awaited stinging sensation came from her neck. She snorted lightly and endured the pain. Looking at the misty mist above her head, she must have been completely confused. That's why she was so easily seduced by this guy and let it mess around. Is it really impossible for flesh and blood to communicate? The brief interaction made her realize that Vivian was like a child who knew nothing. He had simple logic, knew how to learn, was not rough, and was not too unreasonable. Not much better than some sinister and evil-blooded races. No, I can't think too optimistically. Vivian has killed people, and it killed all the nobles in the town when he was young. Perhaps it was for revenge, or maybe it was to help Chaoxi vent his anger. The harmless side it showcases only applies to Chaoxi. The stabbing pain on her neck was not as intense as before, and one could feel that Vivian's movements were very light, as if afraid of biting her. The numbing saliva quickly made the wound lose consciousness and consciousness slowly sank. The hand pressed on the back of Vivian's head relaxed, and Chaoxi hesitated for a moment before gently stroking its head. The soft hair brushed through her fingers, feeling a bit comfortable. Feeling drowsy, Chaoxi unconsciously fell asleep. Chapter 10. Pocket Watch and Clock Tower. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. Relaxing her guard against the enemy was the biggest taboo in carrying out tasks, and it was surprising that Chaoxi could fall asleep in the shower, which only made her feel shocked in retrospect. Vivian sat on top of her, and if she wanted to do something, she would miss any opportunity to resist. Fortunately, except for a bite on her neck, it didn't do anything else to Chaoxi. When she woke up, she lay intact in a comfortable and soft blanket, with no bite marks left on her neck. Chaoxi carefully felt her whole body, and there was no discomfort. She was like what she was soaking in a wooden bucket right now. Wait, exactly the same. Opening the blanket, her fair skin caught the eye. Unexpectedly, she was pulled out of the water by Vivian naked and placed back on the bed. Chaoxi's face was complex, and looking back at the scene at that time, a wave of enthusiasm rushed up. She immediately shook her head, threw away all the miscellaneous thoughts, got up from the wardrobe, and selected a clean and simple dress and loose pants to wear. Her hair was tied up and a head of black hair was coiled at the back of her head. I don't know if it's the numb substance in the saliva of the blood clan. After a deep sleep, I woke up feeling refreshed all over. Chaoxi comfortably stretched out and looked out the window at the cold moonlight, feeling calm and composed. I have long heard that there is no day in the territory of the blood clan, only eternal darkness. Upon reflection, it is indeed so. She came here to sleep for 2 nights, and when she woke up, the moonlight remained completely unchanged. The silver full moon hung motionless from a high place, indicating that the concept of time was not feasible here. Chaoxi couldn't be sure how many days she had been away from human territory. It's time to let those who are anxiously waiting in the church understand the situation. Before encountering Vivian, this is a question that must be carefully considered. It is necessary to contact the church under the watchful eyes of those cunning bloodline members to ensure that they are not suspected. But now, everything will become simple. Chaoxi spoke up and spoke to the empty room, Vivian. The scattered flesh and blood on the floor quickly gathered into a human-sized silhouette, and Vivian, dressed in a stiff dress, suddenly gathered into shape. It is indeed present all the time. Chaoxi still couldn't get used to its elusive way, and after a while, she realized what she wanted to do. She sat at the long redwood carved flower table by the window, and in the dim moonlight, she took out a paper and pen to draw. This time she painted very carefully, with every carving and fine grain being absolutely correct to prevent Vivian from admitting mistakes. She also drew different angles and cast shadows on the side. After finishing the drawing and letting the ink dry, she handed it over to her and asked, "Do you know what this is?" Vivian received it, turned it up and down, and leaned in front of her for a while to carefully examine it. She shook her head in confusion, but upon seeing it, Chaoxi breathed a sigh of relief. She explained, "I threw this thing into the realm of shadows, where the Marquis of Cleos resides, remember." Upon hearing the familiar name, Vivian's aura suddenly changed, his crimson pupils constricted into vertical lines, and his expression made his delicate face appear somewhat terrifying. Chaoxi was frightened by its expression, and as she spoke, she hesitated and spoke cautiously, "Can you help me retrieve it?" Vivian lowered her head in silence. It didn't take on Chaoxi's request, not because it didn't understand, but because it was contemplating. Chaoxi had seen this expression on its face for the first time. Did it weigh the pros and cons, or did it have some reservations? His expression couldn't help but become tense. Fortunately, this state did not last long. Vivian looked up again, as if determined, nodded at her, and her body turned into irregular flesh and blood, disappearing into the floor. Chaoxi breathed a sigh of relief. This is indeed a bit difficult for Vivian. Clans are not allowed to intrude into each other's territory without authorization. Last time, they crossed the border to seize Chaoxi, and if they let it pass, they will inevitably face public anger. But that kind of thing must be retrieved, it is the quickest way to contact the church. After being taken away by the shadow, in case the old foxes noticed any clues, she quietly hid and planned to retrieve it after the situation stabilized. I didn't expect any unexpected changes like Vivian. She didn't come back quickly after leaving this time, and Chaoxi waited for a long time without any movement. She sat on the velvet back chair in front of the table, feeling the quietly passing of time. Just as she was drowsy, the flesh and blood on the floor wriggled again and quickly gathered into a human shape. Vivian appeared again in front of her, showing a noticeable change from her appearance before leaving. The most prominent was the strong bloody smell that came from her nose, causing Chaoxi to sneeze. Its breath was not yet stable, and there was still a lingering haze in its crimson eyes. Vivian reached out his hands and handed the thing he was holding in his palm to Chaoxi. That is an antique copper mechanical pocket watch with a tightly carved cover and a pull tab button directly above it. There are 2 adjusters on the left and right sides of the watch, 1 pull tab and 4 adjusters, totaling 5 buttons. It seems right. Chaoxi's gaze briefly lingered on the pocket watch, reaching out and not taking it over. Instead, she caressed Vivian's cheek, which had a deep red slit. Vivian saw her pitch-black eyes, with incomprehensible emotions flowing through them. It seemed to have caught it, but it also seemed like it was just an illusion. Thumbs brushed away the blood flowing from the wound, and Chaoxi released her hand and took the pocket watch, which was a familiar weight. Fingertips pressed against the pull ring directly above, gently pressing it, only hearing a clicking sound. The watch cover popped open, revealing the precise parts inside. Unlike a typical dial, in general, the scale of a clock can be divided into 12 large and 60 small sections after being circled in one circle. It can be rotated clockwise for 12 hours and the minute hand for 60 minutes. But the pocket watch in her hand has 13 large sections, and there are not 4 small nodes evenly distributed in the middle of each section, but only 1 small node. By this calculation, there are a total of 26 small nodes. It's not that the clockmaker was negligent, but rather intentional. The language used to communicate with the church day and night consists of 26 letters, which then form words and sentences. Starting from the large node in the center, corresponding to each letter from left to right, there are a total of 13 letters in one circle. Then, starting from the small node, corresponding from left to right, the second circle corresponds exactly to 20.6 letters one by one. By adjusting the time of the pocket watch, different words can be formed and connected into sentences. This is something specially given to her by the church before leaving, and she was told how to use it. She can use the pocket watch to transmit information at any time and receive the church's response as soon as possible. Even if a blood clan detects something is wrong with this pocket watch, they cannot decipher its contact method immediately. The calm expression of Chaoxi in the soft moonlight melted together, making it particularly eye-catching. Vivian couldn't help but follow her gaze to look at the pocket watch. What can such a small thing do? Why does Chaoxi care so much about it? The small gesture of quietly approaching was quickly noticed by Chaoxi. Vivian, facing her deep black eyes, still couldn't understand anything. It didn't understand why Chaoxi was looking at her like this. Is she hating herself, or doesn't she want to get close, or is the smell of blood too strong for her to like? The thoughts of flesh and blood people are often very singular. They do not deeply think about why Chaoxi was caught by the shadow, nor do they deeply think about why Chaoxi has not escaped. At the same time, Chaoxi was also considering whether to avoid Xianyan. After all, it was a blood clan, so it was safer to avoid some things. But then again, where can I hide from Vivian's eyeliner? It's full of flesh and blood. What Chaoxi does will be exposed under its eyes. It's better to be calm to avoid causing excessive curiosity. Forget it, business matters. Chaoxi allowed it to stay in the room and shifted her attention to the pocket watch. Her left thumb pressed hard on the central pull ring with a click, but the pull ring did not rebound and seemed to be embedded in a slot. Her movements did not stop, but she pulled out the hour hand adjuster on the upper right side, adjusted the hour hand to the 6 o'clock direction, pressed and fixed it, and then moved the minute hand adjuster on the lower right side, corresponding to the 13 o'clock direction directly above. Take a deep breath and press the regulator back. Far away in the blood-hunting cross church in the city of Croy, a loud bell rang throughout the church. Bishop Xianyan, who was listening to prayers, trembled slightly in his eyes. He put down the book in his hand and apologized to the other bewildered believers in the church. "I'm sorry, I need to temporarily excuse myself for a while." After speaking, he walked steadily out of the lobby and towards the innermost tower of the church. Walking in the swirling corridor, I happened to encounter the rushing deacon Xianyan from above. Xianyan could see the surprise on his face. "Bishop." Seeing the person to be notified coming over, Xianyan welcomed them and went upstairs with him. Xianyan nodded calmly in response to his greeting. Without waiting for the other person to explain, he had already guessed roughly what had happened in his heart and asked with confirmation, "Whose bell belongs to?" "Xianyan." "At exactly 6 o'clock, it's Chaoxi." She succeeded. Members placed within the Blood clan are equipped with a special pocket watch, which is connected to the 3 tower clocks inside the church tower through special means. By ticking the time, information can be transmitted. In order not to confuse their identities, they will be asked to choose a time on their own. Before transmitting information, they will dial the hands of the watch, and one of the towers will automatically calibrate the corresponding time and sound a bell warning. At that time, Chaoxi chose 6 o'clock in the morning, which is not difficult to explain. At 6 o'clock, the sunrise was faint, and Chaoxi was approaching. Under Xianyan's white eyebrows, a pair of half-drooping eyes rarely showed a smile. "I remember, she was the first one in this batch to ring the bell." Xianyan responded, "Yes, there is currently no news from the other few, but the operation has just begun and they may need some time." "Godfather, you don't have to worry.